Patrick was only 7 years old when his neighbor, Auntie Jane, started molesting him, thereby telling him it was a special game. It started with sweets and toys, but soon, the game became his worst nightmare. Patrick Okonkwo was a bright-eyed 7-year-old with a love for adventure and games. He lived with his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Okonkwo, in a small but cozy house in the heart of the city. Patrick's parents were hardworking but always busy. His father, a taxi driver, spent long hours on the road, while his mother worked as a seamstress in a busy shop. They loved Patrick dearly but often struggled to find time for him. After school, Patrick would return to an empty house where he would play alone until his parents came home late in the evening. One day, Patrick's parents decided to ask their neighbor, Auntie Jane, to watch over him after school. Auntie Jane was a middle-aged woman who lived alone in the house next door. She was always kind to Patrick, giving him sweets and telling him stories. Patrick's parents trusted her, and Patrick liked her too at first. But soon, Auntie Jane began acting strangely. She would hug Patrick too tightly and whisper secrets in his ear. "We have a special game, just you and me," she would say with a smile. Patrick didn't understand the game, but Auntie Jane said it was their little secret. She gave him toys and treats to keep him quiet. Patrick felt confused and uncomfortable, but he didn't know how to tell his parents. He started to feel scared whenever Auntie Jane was around, but he didn't know why. Slowly, Patrick began to withdraw from his friends and family, keeping his fears locked inside. One afternoon, Auntie Jane invited Patrick to her house after school. She told him they were going to play this special game again. Patrick hesitated but didn't want to upset her. When they got to her house, Auntie Jane locked the door and told Patrick to sit on the couch. "This is our secret game," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You must never tell anyone or something bad will happen." Patrick's heart raced as Auntie Jane began touching him in ways that made him feel sick. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew it was wrong. Auntie Jane gave him a new toy car afterward and told him he was a good boy for keeping their secret. That night, Patrick had a nightmare. He woke up sweating and crying, but he couldn't tell his parents what was wrong. The next day at school, Patrick was quieter than usual. His teacher, Miss Grace, noticed the change and asked if everything was okay. "I'm fine," Patrick mumbled, avoiding her gaze. But he wasn't fine. The game with Auntie Jane continued, and Patrick's fear and confusion grew. He started wetting his bed at night and became increasingly withdrawn. His parents noticed, but thought it was just a phase. One day, Miss Grace announced a fun game for the class to play. As soon as she said the word game, Patrick's face turned pale. He suddenly shouted, "Auntie, let's play the game Auntie Jane and I play." The class fell silent. Miss Grace knelt beside Patrick and asked gently, "What game do you play with Auntie Jane?" Patrick described the game, and Miss Grace's heart sank. She realized something terrible was happening. She immediately reported the incident to the school principal, who called Patrick's parents and the police. When Patrick's parents arrived at the school, they were shocked and heartbroken. They couldn't believe they had trusted Auntie Jane with their son. The police arrested Auntie Jane, and an investigation began. Patrick's parents tried to comfort him, but the damage was done. Patrick felt a mix of relief and shame. He was glad the game was over, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was his fault. After Auntie Jane's arrest, Patrick's life changed forever. His parents tried to make up for their absence by spending more time with him, but the damage was done. Patrick started seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Adesina, who specialized in childhood trauma. During their sessions, Patrick would sit quietly, his small hands clutching a toy car, the same one Auntie Jane had given him. Dr. Adesina noticed how he avoided eye contact and often stared at the floor. "Patrick," she said gently one day, "can you tell me about the game you played with Auntie Jane?" Patrick's heart raced. He shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't want to talk about it," he whispered. At night, Patrick's nightmares grew worse. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, his sheets soaked from bedwetting. His parents would rush to his room, but Patrick would push them away, feeling too ashamed to explain. One day, Patrick's teacher, Miss Grace, called his parents to school. "Patrick hasn't been himself lately," she said. "He's withdrawn, and his grades are slipping. I'm worried about him." Patrick's parents felt a pang of guilt. They had been so focused on work that they hadn't noticed how much their son was struggling. That evening, they sat down with Patrick and tried to talk to him. "Patrick," his mother said, her voice trembling, "we're so sorry for not being there for you. We love you, and we want to help you." Patrick looked at his parents, his eyes filled with tears. "I just want to forget," he said softly. "But I can't." Years later, Patrick grew up to become a successful gynecologist. He was known for his intelligence and skill, but he carried a dark secret, one that even he didn't fully understand. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Patrick sat alone in his office, staring at a photo of himself as a child. He remembered Auntie Jane's words, "It's just a game, Patrick. Our little secret." Patrick clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He hated himself for what he had become, but he couldn't stop. The trauma from his childhood had twisted his mind, and he began molesting unconscious patients, rationalizing it as a way to regain control. His first victim was a pregnant woman named Mrs. Adebayo. She had come for a routine checkup, and Patrick told her to rest while he examined her. As she drifted off to sleep, Patrick's hands trembled. He knew what he was about to do was wrong, but he couldn't stop himself. Afterward, Patrick felt a wave of guilt and self-loathing. He locked himself in his office and cried, but the cycle continued. His second victim was a university student named Funk, who had come in with stomach pain. Again, Patrick took advantage of her while she was asleep. Patrick tried to justify his actions to himself. "It's just a game," he whispered, echoing Auntie Jane's words. But deep down, he knew it was wrong. He just didn't know how to stop. One day, a young girl named Amina was brought to the hospital by her mother. Amina had been complaining of stomach pain, and Patrick was assigned to examine her. "Just lie down and relax," Patrick said, forcing a smile. "I'll take care of everything." Amina nodded and closed her eyes, but she wasn't asleep. She had heard stories about doctors who took advantage of their patients, and she wasn't about to let that happen to her. As Patrick began his examination, Amina's heart raced. She felt his hands where they shouldn't be, but she stayed still, pretending to sleep. Her mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do. When Patrick finally stepped back, Amina waited until he left the room before bursting into tears. She ran to her mother, who was waiting outside, and whispered, "Mama, the doctor, he touched me." Her mother's face turned red with anger. "What do you mean?" she demanded. Amina explained everything, her voice trembling. Without hesitation, her mother stormed into the hospital administrator's office, demanding justice for her daughter. The news spread quickly, and Patrick's reputation was ruined. He was arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse. In the courtroom, Patrick's parents, now old and frail, sat in the audience, their hearts heavy with guilt. The lawyer asked Patrick why he had committed such terrible acts. With tears in his eyes, Patrick confessed everything. He told the court about the abuse he suffered as a child at the hands of Auntie Jane. He explained how the trauma had haunted him and how he had never been able to talk about it. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Patrick said, his voice breaking. "But I couldn't stop myself. I thought I was in control, but I wasn't. I was just repeating what had been done to me." The courtroom fell silent as Patrick's parents wept, realizing their absence had contributed to his pain. The judge felt pity for Patrick, but knew he had to face the consequences of his actions. Patrick was sentenced to 10 years in a rehabilitation center where he would receive therapy and counseling. In the rehab center, Patrick began to confront his past. He met a kind therapist named Dr. Ibrahim, who helped him understand the cycle of abuse and the importance of breaking it. During one session, Dr. Ibrahim asked Patrick to write a letter to his younger self. Patrick hesitated, but eventually picked up a pen and began to write. "Dear Patrick, I'm so sorry for what happened to you. You didn't deserve it, and it wasn't your fault. I wish I could have protected you, but I was too broken to see the truth. Please forgive me." As Patrick read the letter aloud, tears streamed down his face. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. The story ends on an ambiguous note. Patrick is making progress, but it's unclear whether he will ever fully recover or be forgiven. The scars of his past remain, but there is hope for a better future.